Hello and welcome to the World Water Week Communication Accelerator on Representation. The Communication Accelerator is a special program that is focusing on the pivotal role of communication in societal transformation. Now, the climate crisis is no longer seen as an environmental concern only, and the recognition that it is also a human crisis has really changed the debate. But to build public awareness, achieve climate justice and influence policymakers, we need better inclusiveness and an open debate where all voices are being heard. So in this episode of the Communication Accelerator, we discuss how to create broader representation on issues such as water policy and climate justice, and why it matters so critically who gets heard in the debate. We would sincerely like to thank the Grundfos Foundation for their support and for making today's discussion possible. My name is Malcolm Larry and I'll be your host and moderator for today's panel. Joining me today on the panel is Abigail Kima, Kenyan climate activist and also producer and host of Africa's first youth-led climate podcast. Welcome, Abigail. Karin Lexen, Secretary General at the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. Welcome, Karin. Natasha Wiseman, a journalist with many years reporting experience on water issues both locally and internationally, and the founder of Wise on Water. Welcome, Natasha. And Mayadal Jeppesen, a PhD fellow at the Department of Anthropology at Aarhus University in Denmark. Welcome to you all. It's great to have you with us today. And I'd like to open with a question for each of you, or for all of you rather. Why does it matter who gets heard in the water debate? And what are the consequences of a lack of representation on water issues? Abigail, would you please begin the panel discussion?
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and I'm honored to be on this panel today. To respond to your question, I will make reference to a book written by an African woman called Chimamanda Ngozi, who wrote a book called The Danger of a Single Story, where she highlights the fact that it is quite dangerous to actually speak, or rather listen to a voice from one group of people or a country or one particular person, because then you risk getting solutions that may not actually get to those who are in need. So I'd say it is important because every voice matters, in the sense that we come from different cultures, we come from different communities, and we all have very different needs. So every voice matters. Everyone needs to be heard, because then it brings out the nuances of our lives. And it is the consequences of not having every voice heard is that we risk creating solutions that may not actually get to the people who are in need.
Thank you so much. Karin, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for having me at this very interesting conversation. So what I'm going to say is linking very much up to what's already said. First, it is most often the most vulnerable people that are affected and hit the most by water scarcity or water hazards. And at the same time, it's very often those groups that have the least resources and influence to influence the decisions being made on these issues. So both for moral reasons, but also referring to international law, those affected the most need to be involved in decision making. And second, also referring to what's already said, by widening the representation, we're also opening up windows for new solutions and for new perspectives that we might miss otherwise. And there are a lot of research showcasing that, for instance, introduce people's knowledge and local communities' knowledge are very important and also very often cheaper than conventional solutions. So it would be missing opportunities to not listening to a wider representation. And then third, if we're going to change and transform the society as we need to do in order to deal with water scarcity and climate change, etc., we need to engage the whole society, different sectors, different groups, and it's well researched that if local communities, different sectors, indigenous people are at the center of the decision makers, it's also going to be much better both for well-being and for the environment. To conclude, the lack of representation would ignoring important perspectives, missing opportunities, and excluding those that are most affected by water scarcity and water hazards.
Thank you so much for your comments there. Very interesting. Natasha, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. I'm loving everything I'm hearing so far. I really echo the comments from Abigail and from Karin. Yeah, I mean, one thing that strikes me from the question, who gets heard in the debate, is who even knows we're having a debate, because we are within a sector where everybody knows that these issues are absolutely critical. They are at the heart of human survival, of climate change. And yet, sitting here in the UK, obviously the experience is very different from country to country, as Abigail said, from community to community, but people have no idea there is a water debate. By and large, they do not know there is a water crisis. They are surprised when you tell them that there is, and they're now surprised they have to turn their hose pipes off to stop watering their gardens, but they don't see that in the context of a broader conversation. So I absolutely echo Karin's comments on people that are marginalised in global terms, in community terms, across all sorts of barriers to access. Having that voice at the debate, but we really need to bring everybody with us in all sorts of ways that we might not have imagined. That there is even a debate going on needs to be communicated also for everybody to come together, for us to reach those marginalised groups. That depends on people everywhere understanding that this conversation is being had, and the consequences of that lack of communication, that lack of representation. Well, we're living with them. We are not doing our best work on water, even though we know it's possible. We know the solutions, we can bring them to bear, but not if people don't know they exist, or that there are answers to these questions that they're only starting to hear about.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I really like, who even knows that there's this debate is happening? Because if it's outside of your silo or your community or where you're looking, you may not even be seeing it. Maya, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, of course, I agree very much with what has already been said. Like, people are faced with some very different challenges in the water crisis, and that requires some very different solutions. So representation is absolutely key if we need to address the needs of everyone, especially the most marginalized, which are often overheard. I can use the example of my own research. I just got back from 5 months in Kenya, looking at the water provision in comparing the informal settlements to the formal settlement. So like the slums compared to the rest of the city. And well, everybody in Nairobi is somehow struggling with water. The formal supply is super unreliable, unstable. Of course, if you live in the formal areas, you have the piped infrastructure. You may have the resources to buy water from the water tankers, or maybe you have a borehole in your apartment complex. But the people in the formal settlements, informal settlements, which are often overlooked in the larger debate, even though they are like 50% of the population, they have completely different circumstances. There's no piped water. The fact that they don't have a title deed for their land means that they don't have like the right to a formal water connection, not only with water but also electricity and so many things. And because they don't have that, they don't really have an office they can go to and say, hey, I I have the right to this water. Can you please do something about it?
Yeah.
So yeah, there are some very different circumstances for people living very close to each other.
Yeah, and then you just gave us 3 examples of one city, or one place where there's very different circumstances for different parts of the city and different people living in different circumstances. So as we can see, the nuance that Abigail brought up, comes to the fore really, really quickly. So my first question to Abigail is, Abigail, from your perspective, what voices are missing in the debate, or what voices are not being amplified? And I'm sure as the host and producer of a youth-led podcast on climate, you have some fairly strong opinions on this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. First of all, I'd like to agree with what Maya said. Living in Nairobi, I completely agree that, you're living in the same city, but also experiencing very different circumstances of living, being that one is living in an informal settlement and you are living in a formal settlement. So in terms of what voices that I think are missing, I'd begin with a story, my own story. I come from a community of farmers, and a lot of my childhood involved being in the farm with my parents. And a lot of the things I've been able to achieve is because my parents were able to take me to school, because apart from their day jobs, they could practice agriculture, and this would help them supplement the income from their day jobs, and we'd go to school. That is my siblings and I. And also a very common practice at the moment in the rural areas where I come from is that parents are allowed to come with food produce, and they're able to pay subsidized tuition fees. And so when we speak about water and the people who are missing in this picture, I'd say we practice agriculture as a source of income, as a source of our livelihoods. And earlier this year, well, thanks to climate change, we had extreme water shortage, which is something that has never happened before. Because I come from a very arable area, I mean, we practice agriculture and we produce in large numbers to the extent where we are able to export. But then it got to a point around in March or April where we had water rationing, which is something that has never happened before. So this is my own story. And then we moved to the Horn of Africa, where we've had quite a prolonged drought. And it so happens that these communities living in this area are mostly pastoralists. So apart from them lacking basic access to water for household use, for drinking, it means their animals are also dying because they don't have access to water. And then we move to Uganda, where people experience flash floods, which was quite sad, losing lives and also leaving thousands displaced and lacking access to clean water. So there's no winning in anything. It's either there's too much rainfall and then now we don't have access to clean water. It's either we have extreme drought where we cannot literally use water for anything. You cannot drink water, you cannot use it for households. And then there is the fact that we practice agriculture and we're dependent on the rainfall. And that means thanks to climate change, we do not experience the amount of rainfall that we are used to. And so it's a development issue. It's an issue of food insecurity, which is basically something you cannot live without. So I'd say in terms of the voices that are missing in the picture, it is those that are feeling the brunt of the impacts of climate change to a great extent. And when you talked about the podcast, I actually started it so that we could tell real human stories and put faces to the climate crisis, put faces to water scarcity. Because without it, then there's no real action, because we often tend to ignore the fact that there are real people experiencing real issues who need real solutions for the climate crisis and water crisis in this case.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Thank you for that. One quick question I'd like a quick answer on this one. With your youth-led podcast, are you trying to use your position as a young activist in your country as a way to get more media attention? That sort of Greta Thunberg effect.
Absolutely. So this podcast seeks to basically amplify African climate stories where our voices have often been overlooked. And so, like I mentioned earlier, putting faces to the crisis, putting faces and real human stories to platforms where our voices can be amplified and be heard. And so that is exactly what I'm trying to achieve in this.
Great, thank you so much. Moving on to Natasha Wiseman. Natasha, my question for you is, with your background being in journalism and also long experience in reporting water issues, what do you think the media's responsibility is to ensure more voices are heard?
Well, the media has a key role in ensuring all voices are heard. The job of a journalist is to bridge a gap where there's complex information that needs to be relayed. It's to expose, it's to explain. It's also important for journalists to provide a balanced narrative so that all sides of an issue are heard. And I believe most journalists are committed to do that wherever possible. Obviously, the nature of a story depends on who the intended audience is. And with water, there can be many competing voices. And those, as Karen and others have already said, facing the most serious challenges are often the most marginalised and hardest to reach. It can be dangerous to report from some places. You know, environmental journalists lose their lives and they risk legal battles in terms of some of these stories they are trying to relay. So it is a complex world to report on. Not that that's my personal experience. I'm more on the trade side of the water conversation. But of course, it is the media's responsibility to do this. But there are also certain interests within the media that mean that those stories won't be relayed. So we do have to look to other methods. Abigail's podcast being a case in point. What a fantastic initiative, and similar initiatives should be welcomed with open arms by this sector, because that really is how to get to those stories and how to get them out there. And social media and the platforms that now exist mean that we can tell stories with the help of the mainstream media platforms that we're used to using, or through other channels that are available to us. All of this needs to be brought to bear on this issue. There's no one way. I've set up a positive news platform about water, a not-for-profit called Make Water Famous, and we don't see water through any one lens. We're coming at it from every lens. We're trying to find the place that water connects with people's lives, and they're trying to find solutions, or they're actively embedding new solutions. It can be a community-led project, it can be a major infrastructure project, it can be an arts initiative. You know, we'll cover all kinds of stories about water to make that connection with people, to bring voices that we didn't even know were relevant to water into the open. So that's a contribution I'm making personally. But I think that, you know, the industry itself needs to see its role in communications as central to this, not something done by somebody over there called the media.
Right.
This industry needs to embed communications in everything it does, and to date that has not been a priority. It is a STEM-led sector. It is a science and engineering-led sector and dominated sector in industry terms, and we need to flip that a bit and mainstream the communications role and value the role communicators do in this sector and the potential they could bring.
Yes, I completely agree. And you preempted my second question, which was around social media, and you mentioned, Make Water Famous, etc. I think it was the platform. Is that correct?
Yes, my platform's called Make Water Famous. It's at makewaterfamous.com.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to move to Karen Lexen, please, because we have a tragic situation of environmental defenders being harassed, threatened, and even tragically murdered. And according to the Global Witness report, up to 4 deaths a week. So, Karen, how can we protect environmental defenders better? And how does wider representation play a role here?
So yes, as you are saying, this is really a scary development where we see that this is the most dangerous year on record. And of course, this is also only the tip of the iceberg, where the lethal deaths, causality are just one part of it. There is much wider scope of threats and difficulties facing people that are defending environment, climate activists, indigenous people defending their lands, etc. And they are really at the intersection of the big, huge economic interest in natural resources and a shrinking space for the civil society. And unfortunately, we've seen during the pandemic, the corona pandemic or COVID pandemic, that this situation has very often been used by governments and also by different businesses to even increase threats and difficulties for many civil society people, including and not the least journalists, environmental defenders, and of course in this we are also counting young climate activists. So in order to deal with this increasing problem, we need to really move from declarations. There are a lot of good international agreements on human rights and democracy and the right to speak and press, right to press, free press. But governments need to ensure that we move from paper to implementation. And I think this is really crucial also for being able to communicate different things. And secondly, the state has a responsibility not only to secure the right to speak and the right to defend the environment or to deal with climate issues, but also that these people that don't have the resources are given resources, space, and playing fields to be able to speak up, to be able to put forward their perspectives. So I would say it's a combination of moving also when it comes to businesses from voluntary to legal agreements, moving from paper to real implementation of the human rights and safeguarding those rights. And as a state and government, assuming responsibilities to make this right possible also for marginalized people.
Thank you so much. Again, you preempted my question that I was going to ask around human rights, but you talked about moving from paper to implementation. Could you just give me a 1-minute answer on what you meant by that?
So I mean that in the different countries, we need to strengthen institutions. So what that means is that those governments go to New York or Geneva and they would agree to human rights principles or decisions. But when they get home in their own countries, they have to assume the responsibility for implementing also the possibility. And that means that guarantee, for instance, the security for people that speak up. Very often those deaths happens far away from the capitals.
Yeah.
And especially for indigenous people, you can see that they are really not defended by their governments, even though they have the right to be defended. So the state need to really back up what they are sort of confessing by word, by securing and safeguarding and putting forward resources to make it possible to implement those rights.
Great. Maya Dahl Jeppesen, I'd like to move to you now. You've been doing on-the-ground research on water provisions in Kenya recently. What did you discover about who gets heard in the debate? And what surprised you most while you were working there on this issue?
Well, as I mentioned before, who gets heard is mostly the upper middle class or the people with resources. I think that's quite common from wherever you are in the world. But yeah, I was surprised by this because nobody receives enough water in Nairobi. There are all these alternative institutions and initiatives popping up, NGOs, small businesses, informal networks, especially in the informal settlements. And I think representing them more could be extremely beneficial. Say in Kibera, that's the largest slum in Kenya,
Mm-hmm.
maybe in Africa, maybe the second largest in Africa. That's where I spent most of my time. And because very few people can have a formal connection to a formal water network, which is provided by a state-owned company, there's all these informal vendors everywhere.
Right.
And before I went to do my fieldwork, I read about this, and in a lot of the literature, and when policymakers are talking about them, they're portrayed as this mafia, these cartels who are monopolizing the water and exploiting the poor people, which has some truth to it, but at the same time, they're also people meeting a unmet demand, trying to make a living, and they have extreme importance for how the water flows in the city. And I know that the local water provision company they're often a little like note in their plans that, oh yeah, this is also an issue, people are stealing the water. But I think there's so much potential in including some of these informal networks, because they have so much knowledge of the local context. They have quite a lot of infrastructure in place, actually. Some of it is not perfect. Most of it is not. But I think there's a lot of potential there. And the same goes with all the NGOs working in the informal settlements. They are, filling a huge gap. And I was just surprised to see how little the state was working with them when there was such big potential there. So representing more of those alternative water providers.
Yeah, and I think these informal networks that you mentioned are also very, very interesting. Time is running, so I'd just like to jump to a question to all the panelists, which is, when it comes to water issues, we must mobilise the public because time is not on our side. So how can we use greater representation to communicate more deeply and widely to mobilise the public into action? If I could please just get a very brief answer from each of you, 30 seconds or so. And I'd like to start with Abigail.
Well, thank you so much. So I'd say, one, we are lucky to be in a generation with access to technology. So I'd say use of social media, which is different from mainstream media, and we have platforms where we can openly speak about these issues. And then secondly, while we think about social media, we also have to remember that those who don't have access to the internet. And recently I was speaking to someone on the podcast who's from an Indigenous community and spoke about how they composed a song in their local dialect and have been transmitting it in local radio stations, which is easily accessible to most people. So probably using that also, which is quite relatable to people at the grassroots. And then also thirdly, looking at the younger generation who have potential to learn and have potential to implement these things when they're young. And that also brings the aspect of sustainability in leadership when it comes to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Natasha, your quick answer, please.
Yeah, I love hearing about the song. We've done songwriting workshops about water here in the UK with marginalised groups here in the Gypsy Roma community, and they absolutely loved having the chance to express their experiences of water, which are off-grid and not usual in the UK situation. Absolutely, creativity, imagination, playfulness. Let's bring all this to bear on this issue. And I think we've got a lot to learn from Indigenous activists and the philosophy behind their activism. There's a book called The Red Deal, which centres water in the climate movement and in daily life. And I think we should ask for everything here. Water is everything. Water is life. And to just rip around the edges saying we need to do a little bit better isn't good enough. We need to mainstream water in every action that happens on this planet, from the school curriculum to infrastructure to daily lives. We need to take that from the Indigenous peoples of the world and put water at the heart of lives everywhere.
Thank you so much. Maya, your thoughts, please.
Well, I can mostly speak from my own area, which is urban governance, but I think urban water governance. But I think including more of the success stories of small projects that actually do work and bring water to people would do so much. Like, I think the general debate around water in the cities is that there's just simply not enough. There's nothing we can do. But it's not just a question of, it's a finite resources, which is scarce, but it's a question of like managing the water properly. There's so much going to waste, either like just being pumped out in the middle of the streets, or people using way more water than they should. But there are things to be done to give water to the right people.
Thank you so much. And the final word goes to Karen.
Yeah, thank you. So building on what everyone said, which I agree to, I think what you said today, Emma, really setting good examples and really telling good stories about what is possible, because there is a tendency, at least in the Swedish society, to say that there's nothing we can do in our small country here in Sweden. And that is really pacifying people. So we really need to find ways to tell good stories at the same time as we tell how serious the problem is. And again, engaging people, real participation, and perhaps also capacity building to build courage amongst some of these people that maybe don't have the words or possibilities to express themselves in the way they would like to do. So engaging, putting forward good example, encourage people that really plays a role, what they matter, what they are doing, to build a feeling that it's important what we are doing, and we are important. We are important for our future.
Thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thanks to our panelists today, Abigail Kima, Karen Lexen, Natasha Wiseman and Maya Dahl Jeppesen for a very interesting discussion. We only just scratched the surface. We could talk for hours, but that's all we have time for today. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and once again, we extend our sincere thanks to the Grundfos Foundation for their support today, and thanks to you for watching and for your participation in World Water Week. Thank you.